Hi folks, I'm Chris Marshall with Woodworkers Journal magazine. These days, nearly every table saw manufacturer offers Jobsite versions, like this Craftsman saw. They're lightweight, powerful, and they come on these collapsible wheel stands, so you can roll them easily around the shop, transport them in a vehicle, or even use them outside. And for those reasons, they're very handy. But there's a trade-off for portability. Jobsite table saws are a lot smaller than full-size saws like this. It's just a reality of the convenience of these machines. But there are some simple things you can do to make sure you're using your Jobsite table saw safely and getting the most from its performance. Here are 5 tips to keep in mind. Tip number 1, keep your saw tuned up. Aside from following safe cutting practices and of course sawing with a guard in place, a tuned-up table saw can prevent accidents from happening like kickback. That's when wood binds between the blade and the rip fence during rip cuts and shoots back in your direction at great force, and it's something you never want to have happen. Now, probably the most important part of a tune-up to help prevent kickback is to make sure that the blade is parallel to the miter slot, and your manual will show you how to make this adjustment. Basically, it involves loosening the motor carriage under the table and shifting it one way or the other until the blade lines up with the miter slot, and then checking it with a combination square like this. You take a reading from the front of the blade against one tooth, and then a reading against the back of the blade on the same tooth. You also need to make sure the rip fence is parallel to the miter slots too. And it's easy to check with a scrap of wood that fits snugly into the miter slots. The fence should meet this scrap flush all along its length, and then you'll know it's parallel. If you move your Jobsite table saw around a lot, it can get thrown out of adjustment. So check this parallelism often. It only takes a few minutes. When the blade and rip fence are both parallel to the miter slots, they'll be parallel to one another. And that means safer rip cuts. And here's a second tip. When you're cutting long work pieces like this, use Outfeed Support behind the saw. That can be a roller stand, a work table, or a couple of tall sawhorses with a piece of plywood laid on top. The reason? Gravity is going to work against you. Don't let work pieces fall off the back of the saw when you finish making a cut, or worse, cause you to lose control near the end when your hands are closest to the blade. Sturdy Outfeed Support behind the saw will keep long rip cuts like this under control. And if something feels too large or heavy to cut safely on your table saw, by all means don't do it. A big sheet of MDF like this is a good example. Take it to the floor instead, or over a pair of sawhorses, and cut it into smaller pieces with your circular saw or jigsaw. Then take the smaller pieces to the Jobsite table saw for those final precision cuts. Jobsite table saws tend to come with small miter gauges. You can see the difference between this full-size miter gauge and the one that comes with this saw. But miter gauges are important cross-cutting accessories, so here's tip number 3. Make even a small miter gauge more accurate by adding a longer fence to it. All it takes is a scrap piece of wood and a couple of screws. Some miter gauges will have holes for attaching the fence, but if yours doesn't, drill a couple. Then attach the fence to the miter gauge with short screws. Adding a longer fence to your miter gauge gives you more support when making crosscuts. And if you make this fence tall enough so the blade only cuts partway through it, it'll also give you this handy reference line for lining your cuts up with the blade. The fence will also help reduce tear out on the back edges of your work pieces. It's a great little modification to make. Most Jobsite table saws these days will take a dado set for cutting dados, grooves, rabbets, and other joinery. But here's something to keep in mind. The undercarriage of a Jobsite saw looks a little bit like an inverted circular saw, and it's pretty strong, but it's not as beefy as larger table saws. So here's tip number 4. Go easy on Dado blades. They add a lot of weight and stress to the saw's undercarriage. If you have to stack a wide dado blade, keep the cutting height low to reduce stress on the machine. I actually try and limit the width of my stack to fit through the opening that comes with the standard throat plate. Here, it's about 1/2 inch. And finally, if you decide to take your job site table saw outside, use common sense. That's the 5th tip. Work smart outside. Set the machine up on a plot of level ground, or better yet, use a sidewalk or a paved driveway. This is not a tool you want to tip over on you or have shift around when you're trying to make cuts. And if the stand rocks a bit, one of the feet is probably adjustable so you can steady it, or be sure to add blocking underneath. And once the saw is stable, plug it into a grounded outlet to protect yourself against shocks. There's no question that job site table saws are affordable and versatile machines for woodworkers on a budget or on the go. I hope these 5 safety tips will help you get the most from your investment. Thanks for watching.